Okay, let's talk about self-supervised learning. What is self-supervised learning? Everyone should be familiar with supervised learning. Assignment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are supervised learning. When we do supervised learning, we just have a model. The input of this model is X and the output is Y. So how to make model output the Y? You need to have the data of label. So you can imagine that. Suppose you want to do sentiment analysis today, which you just let the machine read an article and machine need to classify whether the article is positive or negative. You have to find a lot of articles first, and you need to annotate all articles. The article is annotated positive or negative by their meaning. The positive or the negative is our label. We need to have labels and article data to train the supervised model. What is self-supervised? Self-supervised is to think another way to be supervised. Without labels. Suppose we only have a bunch of articles without annotations. But we try to find a way to divide it into two parts. We let one as input data to the model and the other one is used as the label. Assuming you have unannotated data. For example, an article is called X and we divide X into two parts. One is called X prime. And the other one is called X double prime. I know the illustration now is abstractive. A few moments later when we actually talk about Bert, you can understand the meaning of self-supervised better. And how is the case? That there is obviously no way to do supervised training but it still find a way to make supervised training by itself in the end. Okay, so now let's briefly set the concept. We split X into two parts. X prime and X double prime. And then input X prime into the model. And let it output Y. Then, we have to make Y which close to its label X double prime. Which is our learning target. It should be as close as possible to have better performance. Then, this is called self-supervised learning. Self-supervised learning can be deemed as one kind of unsupervised learning. What is unsupervised learning? If we use label during model training, we called it supervised learning. Without label, we called it unsupervised learning. Supervised is the opposite of unsupervised. As we don't use labels. In self-supervised learning, we can say that self-supervised learning is also a unsupervised learning method. But the reason why it's called self-supervised learning is to make the definition clearer. The term self-supervised learning, which Yann LeCun said it at first, is actually not an old word. When did Yann LeCun say this? According to a post on Facebook in April 2019. He said that this method, which I'm talking about now, he called it self-supervised learning. Why don't we call it unsupervised learning? Because unsupervised learning is a relatively large family. There are many different methods in it. In order to make the definition clearer, we called it self-supervised. For example, Cycle GAN, which we mentioned previously, is also a case of unsupervised learning. We also do not use the labeled paired data. However, it is still slightly different from self-supervised learning. There are many methods in the category of unsupervised learning, and self-supervised learning is one of them. Okay, what I just said is very abstractive, which includes dividing X into X prime and X double prime, learning by itself, and generating labels by itself. What does the self-supervised learning mean? Let's take the Bert model directly. Let me explain it to everyone. How self-supervised actually do? Okay. First, Bert is a transformer encoder. And we have already talked about transformer. We also spent a lot of time introducing encoder and decoder. The encoder in transformer is Bert. It is actually the architecture of Bert. It's exactly the same as the encoder of transformer. There are a lot of self-attention and residual connection inside it. There are also normalization and so on. Then, this is Bert. If you have forgotten what components are in the encoder, it is already okay. Anyway, the key point you need to remember is that Bert can input a row of vectors and then output another row of vectors. The length of output is same as the length of input. What is the input of the Bert? Bert is generally used in the natural language processing, which used in the text scenario. So generally, its input is a sequence of text, which is also a sequence of data. When we are actually talking about self-attention, we also said that not only text is a kind of sequence but voice also can be regarded as a sequence. Even image can be seen as a bunch of vector. The same idea as BERT is not only used in NLP or used in text. It can also be used for voice and video. Because BERT was just first used in text, we all take text as an example here. You can say that I change the input to voice. Or change input to image. It's all the same. Okay, the input of BERT is a piece of text here. The next thing we need to do is randomly masking some input text. Which parts will be masked? The masked part is decided randomly. For example, we enter 100 tokens. What is a token? A token is your basic unit when processing a paragraph of text. The unit size of this token is decided up to you. In Chinese text, we usually regard a Chinese characters as a token. When we enter a sentence, some words will be randomly masked in there. Which part need to be masked? It is decided randomly. How to mask it? What is the detail implementation of masking? There are two ways. The first approach is to replace a word in the sentence with a special symbol. We use mask token to represent the special symbol. You can regard it as a new character. This character is completely a new word. And it is not in your dictionary. It means to mask the original text. Another way is to randomly replace a word with another word. Originally, the Chinese word wan was placed here. Then you can just choose another Chinese word and replace it. It can change to the word one, change to the word sky, change to the word big, or change to the word small. We just replace it with a certain word that is chosen randomly. So there are two ways to do masking. One is to add a special token called mask. The other one is to replace a certain word with another word. Then, which one to use? Both can be used. Which one to be used is also randomly determined. So when BERT is training, we should input a sentence to BERT and first randomly decide which part of Chinese characters will be masked. After that, we decide how to do masking. Is the masking part going to be replaced by the special symbol, mask? Or just be replaced with another Chinese characters? Both of these two methods can be used. What do we do after masking? After masking, we also input a sequence to BERT. We regard the corresponding output of the BERT as another sequence. Next, we look the corresponding output of masking part in the input sequence. We still input word in the masking part and it may be a mask token or a random word. There still is word in the token being masked or replaced. And it still outputs a vector. Then, this vector will pass a linear transform. The so-called linear transform means that the input vector will multiply with a matrix. Then do softmax and output a distribution. What is the meaning of the distribution in the output? This is the same distribution of output as the one we mentioned in the sequence-to-sequence model. When we were doing translations using transformers, the output is a very long vector that contains every Chinese character that we would like to process. Every character corresponds to a score. And it is a distribution. Because of the softmax function. Now, how do we train the BERT model? Let's first talk about the objective of the training. We have the knowledge of what the masked character is. While BERT doesn't. Since it was masked when we gave it to BERT. BERT wouldn't know what the character was. However, humans would know what the masked character is. Which is wan, from the word Taiwan. So, the objective of the training is to output a character that is close to the real answer. Which is the character wan in Chinese. We can represent the character by a one-hot vector and minimize the cross-entropy loss between the output and the one-hot vector. Or to make it simpler, we are actually solving a classification problem. It's just that the number of classes is as many as the number of Chinese characters. It depends on how many Chinese characters are there. Let's say it's roughly around 4,000. That makes it a 4,000 class classification problem. Now, what BERT has to do is predict what is masked successfully. The masked character, wan, belongs to the class, wan. During training, we add a linear model after BERT and train them both together. So, inside BERT, is an encoder of a transformer, which has a bunch of parameters. The linear model is a matrix, which also has some parameters, albeit quite a bit lower in quantity. When compared to BERT, those two need to be jointly trained and try to predict what the covered character is together. That's it. This is called masking. In fact, when we train a BERT, we'll also use another method in addition to masking. This additional method is called next sentence prediction. What it means is that we come up with two sentences from our database, which is a large collection of sentences we can get by crawling and searching documents on the internet, and we add a special token between the two sentences. The special token added between the two sentences represents the separation between them. This way, BERT can know that these two sentences are different sentences. Because there is a separator between the two sentences, we will also add a special token at the start of the sentence. Here we use CLS to represent this special token. We will later know the use of this special token. Now, we have a very long sequence that includes two sentences, separated by the SEP token and the CLS token at the front. If we pass it into BERT, it should output a sequence, since the input is also a sequence. This is the purpose of the encoder after all. BERT is a transformer encoder, so that is something BERT can do. For now, we only take the output corresponding to CLS. There are of course other outputs, but we'll ignore them for now. We will only look at the output of CLS, and we will multiply it by a linear transform. Now what? Now it has to do a binary classification problem that has two possible outputs, yes or no. What does it mean by yes or no? This method is called next sentence prediction. So we need to predict whether the second sentence is the subsequent sentence of the first one. If the second sentence are indeed subsequent sentence, we need to train BERT to output yes when the second sentence is not the subsequent one. BERT needs to output no as the prediction. That's all. However, later researchers found out that next sentence prediction isn't really helpful for the task BERT is going to do. What is BERT going to do next? We will get to it soon. In short, this method is not very useful. For example, there is a paper called Robustly Optimized BERT Approach, or RoBERTA in short. Inside the paper, it clearly stated that implementing the next sentence prediction method did little to no help at all. Then, this concept somehow became mainstream. Following that, another paper said next sentence prediction was useless. So many more papers after it started to say it's useless too. For example, ScanBERT and XLNet all said that the next sentence prediction method is useless. One of the possible reasons that it might be useless is that next sentence prediction is too simple and it's an easy task. Predicting whether two sentences are connected isn't a particularly difficult task perhaps. The typical approach to this task is that you first choose a sentence at random, and then choose the sentence that is going to be connected to the previous one, either from the database or at random. Usually, when we choose a sentence randomly, it looks a lot different from the previous sentence. For BERT, it isn't too hard to predict if the two sentences are connected. So, nothing too useful was learned when training BERT to complete the task of next sentence prediction. There is another method similar to next sentence prediction, and we'll introduce it later. It appears to be more useful on paper. It is called sentence order prediction, or SOP in short. The main idea of this method is that the two sentences that we picked initially could be connected. There could be two possibilities. Either sentence 1 is connected behind sentence 2, or sentence 2 is connected behind sentence 1. There are two possibilities, and we ask BERT which one it is. Perhaps because this task is more difficult, it seems to be more effective. It was used in a model called Albert, which is an advanced version of BERT. Since the name Albert is similar to Albert Einstein, I put an image of Einstein in my slide. Every model we've talked about has its own name. Don't claim that you have proposed a model without giving the model a name. So, how do we use BERT? We just mentioned what BERT can do. When we're training, we asked Bert to learn 2 tasks. One is to cover up some characters. Chinese characters to be specific. And ask it to fill in the missing character. It is able to do that. The other task showed that it could predict whether 2 sentences have sequential relationship. However, I said that this trick seems to be useless. So overall, what actually did Bert learn? It learned how to fill in the blanks. What if the task I want to solve is not a fill-in-the-blank question? What's the use of Bert when it could only fill in blanks? Since it was only trained to fill in blanks, it can only be used to fill blanks, right? The magical thing about it is that after you trained a model to fill in blanks, it can be used for other tasks. These tasks don't have to be related to filling in the blanks. It could be something totally different. Bert can still be used for these tasks nonetheless. These tasks are the ones where Bert is actually used, and they are called downstream tasks. Later on, we will talk about some examples of downstream tasks. We will give a few concrete examples later. The so-called downstream tasks means the tasks that you actually care about. But when we want Bert to learn to do these tasks, we still need some labeled information. We will take a close look later. In short, Bert only learns to fill in the blanks. But later on, it can be used to make all kinds of downstream tasks you are interested in. It's like stem cells in an embryo. It has all kinds of unlimited potential. Although it hasn't used its power yet, it only can fill in the blanks. But later on it has the ability to solve all kinds of tasks. We just need to give it a little data to elicit it. And then it can do it. You know that embryonic stem cells are those that can differentiate into all kinds of different cells, such as cardiomyocytes, myocyte, etc. Bert is also the same. You give it some labeled data. It can learn all kinds of tasks. It can differentiate into functional cells for various tasks. The differentiation of Bert into functional cells for various tasks is called fine-tuning. You might call it wei tiao in Chinese. So, we often hear people say, he fine-tunes Bert, which means he has a Bert on his hand, and he applies fine-tuning on this Bert, so that it can do a certain kind of task. In contrast to fine-tuning, the process of generating this Bert before fine-tuning is called pre-training. So, the process of generating Bert is self-supervised learning. But, you can also call it pre-training. You will realize that, in the homework, we actually repeatedly say that we don't use pre-trained models. If you don't know what a pre-trained model is, it doesn't matter. Anyway, since you don't know what it is, you won't be able to use it. If you know what it is, here we ask you not to use this method of self-supervised learning. You should not search somewhere else for a model of self-supervised learning to apply it directly on the homework. Because these methods often come with incredible and powerful abilities, which will make it boring about what you are going to do. Okay. There is actually a Bert homework next. Homework 7 is to use Bert. So, in homework 7, of course, you can use pre-trained model. This is the only homework that you can use a pre-trained model. Because homework 7 is to fine-tune Bert. So, of course, you have to use pre-trained Bert to perform fine-tuning. So, only in homework 7, you can use pre-trained models. Okay. Before we talk about how to fine-tune Bert, we should first take a look at its ability. Today, to test the ability of self-supervised learning, usually, you will test it on multiple tasks. Since we just said that Bert is like an embryonic stem cell, and it is going to differentiate into functional cells for all kinds of tasks, we usually don't just test its ability on a single task. You would let this Bert differentiate into functional cells for all kinds of tasks to see how accurate it gets on every tasks. And we average them to get an overall score. Such collection of different tasks, which a model is tested on, we could call it the task set. The most well-known benchmark in the task set is called GLUE. It is abbreviation of General Language Understanding Evaluation. Inside GLUE, there are 9 tasks in total. Generally, you want to know whether a model like Bert was trained well or not. You will fine-tune it. And fine-tune it on 9 separate tasks. So, you will actually get 9 models for 9 separate tasks. You take a look at the average accuracy of these 9 tasks. Then, you get a value. This value represents the performance of this self-supervised model. Let's take a look at the performance of BERT on glue. With BERT, the glue score, which is the average score of the 9 tasks, does increase year by year. Okay, in this picture, the horizontal axis indicates different models. It is listed here. You can find that, besides Elmo and GPT, others are BERT, 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 BERT. A lot of BERT. All kinds of BERT. The black line indicates human work, which is the accuracy that humans get on this task. Then, we treat this as 1. Each point here represents a single task. Then, why do you compare it to human accuracy? The human accuracy is 1. If they are better than humans, the values of these points will be greater than 1. If they are worse than humans, the values of these points will be less than 1. That's because of these tasks, whose evaluation metrics may not be accuracy. The evaluation metrics used for each task are different. It may not be accuracy. If we just compare their values, it may be meaningless. So, here we are looking at the difference between humans. So, you will realize that only on 1 task of the original 9 tasks, machines can do better than humans. As more and more technologies were proposed, more and more, there are 3 other tasks that can be done better than by humans. For those tasks far worse from humans, they are also gradually catching up. The performance of the machine is also slowly catching up. The blue curve indicates the average of the machine's glue scores. It was also found that some recent strong models, for example, XLNet, even surpassed human beings. Of course, it is just the result of these datasets. It does not mean that machine really surpasses humans in general. It surpasses humans in these datasets. What does it mean? It means that these datasets is not representative of actual performance, and it's not difficult enough. So, after glue, someone made super glue. They find harder natural language processing tasks for the machine to solve. Okay, the meaning of showing this picture is mainly to tell you that with the technology like BERT, it is true that the ability of machine in natural language processing takes another step forward. Okay, how exactly is BERT used? BERT is used like this. We will give 4 cases about application of BERT. The first case is like this. We assume that our downstream task is to input a sequence and output a class. It is a classification problem, and the input is a sequence. What kind of task is inputting a sequence and outputting a class? For example, sentiment analysis, which is giving the machine a sentence and tell it to judge whether the sentence is positive or negative. For BERT, how does it solve the problem of sentiment analysis? You just give it a sentence. Which is the sentence that you want to use it to determine sentiment? And put the CLS token in front of this sentence. I just mentioned CLS token. The last time we mentioned it is about talking. The next sentence prediction, we put the CLS token in front and throw it into the BERT. These 4 inputs actually correspond to 4 outputs. Then, we only look at the part of CLS. CLS outputs a vector here, and we apply linear transformation to it, which multiplies it by a matrix of linear transformation. Softmax is omitted here. Through softmax, it determines the output class is positive, negative or other. However, in practice, you must have the labeled data for your downstream tasks. In other words, BERT has no way to solve sentiment analysis problems from scratch. You still have to provide BERT some labeled data. You need to provide it a lot of sentences and their positive or negative labels to train this BERT model. During training, we actually put BERT together with this linear transformation to call it a complete sentiment transportation model. In the training time, both the linear transform and BERT model utilize the gradient descent to update the parameters. As for now, the parameters of the linear transform are randomly initialized, while the parameters of BERT is initialized from the BERT that learned to fill in the blanks. Every time when we train the model, we have to initialize the parameters. We utilize gradient descent to update these parameters, right? Then try to minimize the loss. Likewise, we have a loss to minimize. For example, we are doing the sentiment classification. However, we have the BERT now. We don't have to randomly initialize all parameters. The only part we randomly initialized is here. The backbone of BERT is a huge transformer encoder. The parameters of this network are not randomly initialized. We directly took the BERT that has learned to fill in the blanks. To initialize the parameters here, put the BERT parameter that learned to fill in the blanks into the BERT in this place as parameter initialization. Why do we do that? Why do we use the BERT that learned to fill in the blanks and put it here again? The most intuitive and simplest reason is that it performs better than network with randomly initialized new parameters. It will get better performance than a random initialized BERT when you put the BERT that learned to fill in the blanks here. There is an example in the article. The horizontal axis is the training epochs. The vertical axis is the training loss. Everyone must be very familiar with this kind of figure so far. As the training progresses, of course, the loss will get lower and lower. The most interesting part of this figure is that there are various tasks. We won't explain the details of these tasks. I just want to show that there are various tasks. Fine-tune means model is used with pre-training. That is the BERT part of the network. That encoder of the network. The parameter of that part is initialized by the parameters of BERT that learned to fill in the blanks. Scratch means the whole model, including the BERT and the encoder part are randomly initialized. Scratch is the dotted line. The dotted line is Scratch. From the results of Scratch you can have some observations. First of all, when training the network, the loss drops relatively slow. Compared to the ones initialized with BERT that learned to fill in the blanks, the loss drops relatively slow. In the end, the loss of network with randomly initialized parameters is still higher than that initialized the parameters of the BERT learned to fill in the blanks. So these are the benefits that BERT brings to us. Let's stop here. I actually left a slide here on purpose. Just want to mention that there will be more content. I want to stop here to make sure everyone understands what I mean so far. You have to make sure you understand what I talked so far, so as to realize the following parts. So I want to ask, do you have any questions for this part? Can you realize what is pre-train and fine-tune? During the break time, there is a classmate asked whether the training method of BERT is a semi-supervised method? Is it semi-supervised or unsupervised? Actually, it's both semi-supervised and unsupervised. It's unsupervised or self-supervised when learning to fill in the blanks. However, when you utilize the BERT to do the downstream tasks, you need human-labeled data to do the downstream tasks. You use a lot of in-labeled data when you do the self-supervised learning. Plus, the downstream tasks require a small amount of labeled data, so it becomes semi-supervised. The so-called semi-supervised means that you have a lot of in-labeled data and a small amount of labeled data. This situation is called semi-supervised. So the whole process of using BERT is to apply pre-train and fine-tune in a row. It can be regarded as a semi-supervised method. Do you have any questions so far? If there's question, let's move on. The following content resembles Case 1 introduced previously. So if you can understand what Case 1 is talking about, you will find that they are actually the same. Followingly, there are 3 more cases. Okay, if you have no problems, we will move on. Okay, what are the next 3 cases? The second case is to enter a sequence and then output another sequence, while the length of input and output are the same. We gave similar examples when we talked about the self-attention. What kind of task requires the input and output length to be the same? For example, the pause tagging. Pause tagging means part of speech tagging. You give the machine a sentence. It has to tell you the part of speech of each word in this sentence. Even though the word is the same, it may have different parts of speech. I talked about it in the section of self-supervised learning. Okay, how does BERT tackle this task? You just enter a sentence to Bert. Afterwards, for every token in this sentence, it is a word in Chinese that has a corresponding vector representing that word. Then these vectors are passed through a linear transformation and a softmax layer sequentially. Finally, the network predicts the category that the given word belongs to. For example, it's part of speech. Of course, the category depends on your task. If your task differs, the corresponding category will also be different. The next thing you have to do is exactly the same as case 1. In other words, you need to have some labeled data. This is still a typical classification problem. The only difference is the BERT part, the encoder part of the network, whose parameters are not randomly initialized. It already found nice parameters during the pre-train process. Is there any question so far? If no, let's go to the case 3. In case 3, model input 2 sentences and output a category. Of course, the examples that we showed here belong to the natural language processing. However, you can change these examples into other tasks. For instance, you can change them into speech tasks, or change them into the computer vision tasks. I have mentioned in the section of self-supervised learning that speech, text, and images can be represented as a row of vectors. Although the following examples are in text, this technology is not only limited to process texts. It can also be used for other tasks such as computer vision. Okay. The third case, take 2 sentences as input and outputs a category. What kinds of tasks take such input and output? The most common one is the natural language inference. Its abbreviation is NLI. What does it do? Here are 2 input sentences for the machine. A sentence called premise is the premise. Another sentence is called hypothesis. What the machine does is to judge whether it is possible to infer the hypothesis from the premise. Does this premise contradict this assumption? Or are they not contradictory sentences? In this example, our premise is that a man is riding a horse. Then he jumped over a broken plane. Which sounds weird, but this sentence actually looks like this. This is an examples in a benchmark corpus. There was a man riding a horse and jumping over the plane. He was also doing a juggling. The inference here is that this person is at a diner. Is this person at a diner? It's not, so this is a contradiction. So what the machine has to do is take 2 sentences as the input and output the relationship between these 2 sentences. This kind of task is quite common. Where can it be used? For example, position analysis. Given an article, and there is a comment below. Does the message agree with this article? Or opposed to it? You just put the article and the comment together into the model. What the model wants to predict is the position of each comment. There are in fact lots of applications that take in 2 sentences and output 1 category. Okay, how does BERT solve this problem? You just give it 2 sentences. And we put a special token between these 2 sentences, and put the CLS token at the very beginning. This sequence is the input of BERT. Then BERT will output another sequence, whose length is the same as the outputs. But we only take the CLS token as the input of the linear transform. And it decides the category of these 2 input sentences. Are these 2 sentences contradictory? For NLI, you have to ask whether these 2 sentences are contradictory or not. Okay, this is case 3. We still need some labeled data to be able to train this model. Note that this part of BERT is no longer randomly initialized. It is initialized with some pre-trained weights. Okay, let's move forward to the 4th case. The 4th case is actually in our homework. If you don't understand the previous cases, just forget about them. This 4th case is what we are going to do in homework 7. Homework 7 is a question answering system. That is, after the machine reads an article and you ask it a question, it will give you an answer. But the questions and the answers here are slightly restricted. This is extraction-based QA. That is, we assume that the answer must appear in the article. The answer must be a snippet in the article. Okay, how do you make this QA system? How to make an extraction-based QA system? In this task, an input sequence contains an article and a question. Both the article and the question are a sequence. For Chinese, each D here represents a Chinese character. Each Q here represents a Chinese character. You put D and Q into a QA model. What will it output? We want it to output two positive integers s and e. According to these two positive integers, we can cut a paragraph directly from the article, and it is the answer. Given s and e, we want to take the segment from the s word to the e word in this article. This segment is the correct answer. This sounds very crazy. However, this is a quite standard method used nowadays. 6 years ago, when I first heard that this mechanism can solve QA tasks, I couldn't believe it. But anyway, this is a very common method today. Okay, if you still don't understand what I'm talking about, to be more specific, here is a question and an article. And the correct answer is gravity. How does the machine output the correct answer? Your QA model should output s equals to 17 and e equals to 17 to represent gravity, since it is the 17th word in the whole article. So s equals to 17 and e equals to 17 means to output the 17th word as the answer. Or give another example. The answer is within a cloud, which is the 77th to the 79th word in the article. What your model has to do is to output the two positive integers 77 and 79. Then the segment in the article, from the 77th word to the 79th word, should be the final answer. This is what homework 7 will ask you to do. Of course, we do not train the QA model from scratch. To train this QA model, we use BERT pre-trained models. Well, how to solve this kind of QA problem with pre-trained BERT? This solution looks like this. For BERT, you have to show it a question, an article, and a special token between the question and the article. Then we put a CLS token at the beginning. This is the same as the case of natural language inference. Just in natural language inference, one is the premise and the other is the conclusion. While, here, one is the article and the other is the question. In this task, the only thing you need to train from scratch are only two vectors. By training from scratch, I mean random initialization. Here we use the orange vector and the blue vector to represent them. The length of these two vectors are the same as the output of BERT. Assuming the output of BERT are 768-dimensional vectors, these two vectors are also 768-dimensional vectors. Then, how to use these two vectors? First of all, calculate the inner product of this orange vector and those output vectors corresponding to the documents. Since there are three tokens representing the article, it will output three vectors. Calculate the inner product of these three vectors and the orange vector. You will obtain three values. Then pass them through a softmax function and you will obtain another three values. This inner product is quite similar to attention. You can think of the orange part as query and the yellow part as key. This is an attention. Then we should try to find position that has maximum score. It's here. The inner product of the orange vector and D2. If this is the max, S should be equal to 2. The starting position of your output should be 2. The blue part does exactly the same thing. The blue part represents where the answer ends. We calculate the inner product of this blue vector and the yellow vectors corresponding to the article. Then, we also use a softmax here. Lastly, find the max value. If the third value is the largest, E should be 3. The correct answer is D2 and D3. So what your model has to do is actually to predict the starting position of the correct answer, because the answer must be in the article. Okay, if the answer is not in the article, you can't use this trick. Here we suppose the answer must be in the article. We have to find the starting position and the end position of the answer in the article. This is what a QA model needs to do. Of course you need some training data to be able to train this model. Note that these two vectors are initialized randomly, while BERT is initialized by its pre-trained weights. So let's talk about this part. Do you have any questions? Is there a limit on the input size of the token? Are you talking about there is no limit to the length of the input, right? Well, this is a very good question. Let me repeat it. Is there any limit to the length of the Bert's input? Theoretically, no. In reality, yes. In theory, because Bert model is an transformer encoder. So it can input very long sequence. As long as you have to be able to do self-attention. But computation complexity of self-attention is extremely high. So you find that in practice, Bert can't actually input sequence that is too long. You may at most input 512 length sequence. If you input a 512 length sequence, self-attention in the middle is about to generate the 512 times 512 size of attention metric. Then you may be overwhelmed by computations. So actually its length is not infinite. In the teaching assistance program, it have already dealt with this problem for everyone. We limit the length of input for Bert. And it takes long time to train with an article. What will we do? We divide the article into several paragraphs. Then each time, we will only take one of them for training. We will not input the entire article into Bert. Because the distance you want is too long. You will have problems with training. So does that answer your question? Thank you. Okay, do you have any questions? I'm sorry. I didn't hear it very clearly. Could you say it again? What does it relate to the fill-in-the-blank questions? Wow, this question is great. You will argue that this fill-in-the-blank question is just a fill-in-the-blank question. But I'm going to do a Q&A right here. What's the relationship between these two things? Okay, let me keep your guessing. I'll try to answer you later. Okay, are there any questions? Do you have any further questions? If not, then we will continue. The next slide will tell you. Bert is such a well-known model. And it can do anything. Then you might think that Bert. In pre-train, it's just filling in the blanks. You should be able to do this yourself. You will revise the program of homework 4. And also let the machine learn how to do fill-in-the-blank questions. So what's so great about this? What's great is, you really can't do this yourself. You really can't train it yourself. First of all, the earliest Google Bert. The size of data it uses is already large. It contained 3 billion vocabulary in the data. How many words do 3 billion have? It's 3,000 times the complete works of Harry Potter. The complete works of Harry Potter is about 1 million words. Then when Google was training Bert, the earliest Bert, it used 3,000 times as much data as the complete works of Harry Potter. So it will be a bit painful for you to deal with it. The more painful thing is the training process. Why do I know that the training process is painful? Because there is a student in our lab. He is actually one of the teaching assistants. He tried to train a Bert himself. He feels that he can't reproduce Google's results. Okay, so in this picture, the vertical axis represents the glue score. We just talked about glue, right? There are 9 tasks and 9 tasks on average. The average score is called the glue score. Okay, so the blue line is Google's original Bert's glue score. Then our goal is actually not to implement Bert. Our goal is to implement Albert. Albert is an advanced version. It's the orange line. The blue line is Albert trained by ourselves. But what we actually train is not the largest version. Bert has a base version and a large version. For the large version, it's hard for us to train it by ourselves, so we try to train with the smallest version. See if it have the same as the result from Google. Google is like this. You might say that this 3 billion data. There seems to be a lot of data for 3 billion words. Actually, because it is unlabeled data. So you just sort a bunch of text from the internet. There is same amount of information. So it's not very difficult for you to climb this level of information. The hard part is the training process. Okay, this horizontal axis is the training process. How many times does the parameter update? About 1 million times of updates. How long will it take? Run with TPU for 8 days. So your TPU has to run for 8 days. If you do it on Colab, this one needs to run for at least 200 days. You may not get the results even until next year. So it's really hard for you to train this kind of BERT model by yourself. Fortunately, the homework is just to fine-tune it. You can fine-tune it on Colab. It only take about half an hour to an hour to fine-tune Bert on Colab. But if you want to train it from scratch, that is, train it to do fill in the blanks, it will take so much time and you can't do it by yourself on Colab. Okay, then you might ask, why should we train a Bert ourselves? Google has already trained Bert, and these pre-trained models are public. We train one by ourselves, and the result is similar to Google's Bert. What's the point? Okay, what do you want to do here? Actually want to establish Bert embryology. What does Bert embryology mean? We know it requires very large computing resources in the training process of Bert. So we want to know if it's possible to save these computing resources. Is it possible to make it train faster? To know how to make it train faster, maybe we can start by observing its training process. No one has ever observed the training process of Bert in the past. Because in Google's paper, they just tell you that I have this Bert. Then it does a good job in various tasks. What did Bert learn in the process of learning? To fill in the blanks? When does it learn to fill in verbs in this process? When do it learn to fill in nouns? When does it learn to fill in pronouns? No one has studied in this topic. So after we train a Bert by ourselves, we can observe when Bert learned to fill in what kind of vocabulary. How does it improve the ability of fill in the blank? Okay, the details are not the focus of this course, so I won't talk about it here. I attach the link of the paper here for your reference. I just take the conclusion here. It's not the same as what you intuitively imagine. Okay, we haven't talked about why Bert is good yet. But let's add one thing. None of the aforementioned tasks include Sequence 2 sequence model. What if we want to solve the Sequence 2 sequence model? Bert is only a pre-train encoder. Is there a way to pre-train the decoder of Sequence 2 sequence model? Yes, but what to do? You just say I have a Sequence 2 sequence model. There is a transformer. There is also an encoder and a decoder. The input is a string of sentences and the output is a string of sentences. Connected them with cross-attention in the middle. Then you deliberately make some disturbance on the input of the encoder to corrupt it. I will tell you specifically what I mean by corrupt later. Then what is decoder? Decoder is the sentence I want to output. Exactly the same sentence as before I corrupt it. Encoder sees the corrupted result. Then the decoder should output the result before the sentence was corrupted. Training this model is actually pre-training a Sequence 2 sequence model. Okay, how to corrupt it? There are various ways. There is a paper called Mass. In Mass, it said the method to corrupt is just like WAHT Bert does. Just cover up some places and it's over. Then there are various ways to corrupt it. For example, delete some words. Mess up the order of words. Rotate the order of words. Or insert a mask to get rid of some words again. In short, there are various methods. After breaking the input sentence, it can restore it by the sequence-to-sequence model. There is a paper called BART. It just uses all of these methods. I found that it is better to use all possible methods. It can be better than Mass. I want to ask a question. Why is it not a character from Sesame Street? You might ask that. There are so many ways to break it. And there are so many masking methods. Which method is better? Maybe you want to do some experiments by yourself to try it out. Let me tell you that you don't have to do it. Google did it for you. There is a paper called T5. What is the full name of T5? It is Transfer Text to Text Transformer. There are 5 T, so it's called T5. Inside this T5, it just made various attempts. It has done every combination you can imagine. That's it. The paper has 67 pages. You can go back, read it, and see the conclusion. The T5 is trained on a corpus called Colossal Clean Crawled Corpus. For this dataset, colossal is colossal, which means very huge. It's called C4. You use C4 to train T5. Everyone is a master of naming. This naming is very powerful. How big is this C4? C4 is a public dataset. You can load it. It is public. But its original file size is 7 terabytes. You can download it. But you don't know where to save it. And after it's loaded, You can do pre-processing by the script provided by Google. The script has a document. I see it released on the website. The document on the Corpus website says that it takes 355 days for pre-processing with 1 GPU. You can download it, but you have problems with the pre-processing. So, you can find that the amount of data and models are amazing in deep learning. Okay, the next step is to answer the question from classmates. Why is BERT useful? Here, we first provide the most common explanation. The most common explanation is that when inputting a string of text, every text has a corresponding vector. For this vector, let's call it embedding. What's special about this vector? It is special because these vectors represent the meaning of the input word. For example, the model inputs Taiwan da shui and outputs 4 vectors. These 4 vectors represent the Tai, Wan, Da, and Shui. What does it mean? More specifically, suppose you put the vectors corresponding to these words and draw it, or calculate the distance between them. You will find that words with more similar meanings, their vectors are closer. For example, fruits and grasses are both plants. Their vectors are relatively close. But this is a fake example. I will show you a true example later. Birds and fish are animals, so they may be closer. That electricity is not an animal, nor a plant, so it is not close. You might ask that. There are ambiguities in Chinese. In fact, not only in Chinese. Many languages have ambiguities. BERT can consider the context. So, the same word. For example, the word apple. Its context is different from the other apple. Their vectors will not be the same. The fruit, apple, and the mobile phone, apple, are both apple, but according to the context, their meanings are different. So, their vector and corresponding embedding will be very different. The fruit, apple, may be closer to grass. The mobile phone, apple, may be closer to electricity. Can BERT do this? This is just a silly example. And I will show you a real example now. Suppose we now consider the word apple. We will collect a lot of sentences that have the word apple, like drinking apple juice, Apple MacBook, and so on. Then, we put these sentences into the BERT. Next, we will calculate the corresponding embedding of the word apple. Input drinking apple juice and get a vector for apple. Apple MacBook also has a vector for apple. These 2 vectors will not be the same. Why not the same? There is self-attention in the encoder. So according to different contexts of the word apple, the resulting vector will be different. Next, we calculate the cosine similarity between these results. That is, calculate their similarity. The result is like this. There are 10 sentences here. The apple in the first 5 sentences represent edible apples. For example, the first sentence is, I bought apples to eat today. The second sentence is, what is the average per kilogram of imported Fuji apples? The third sentence is, apple tea is terrible. The fourth sentence is, the season of chili apple is coming. The fifth sentence is, something about imported apple. These 5 sentences have the word apple. The next 5 sentences also have the word apple, but all of them refer to Apple Incorporation. For example, Apple is about to announce a new iPhone next month. Apple obtains new patent. I bought an Apple phone today. Apple shares have fallen. Apple bet on fingerprint recognition technology. There are 10 apple. Calculate the similarity between each pair and get a 10 times 10 matrix. Each grid here represents the similarity between embeddings of 2 apple. Then you will find that the apple in the first 5 sentences is close to yellow. The higher the calculated value is, the lighter this color is. So, the degree of similarity between me and myself must be the biggest. The degree of similarity between me and others must be smaller. The first 5 apple have a relatively high degree of similarity between each others. The last 5 apple also have a higher similarity within them. But the similarity between the first 5 apple and the last 5 apple is relatively low. BERT knows that the first 5 apple refer to edible apples, so they are closer. The last 5 apple refer to the Apple Incorporation, so they are closer. In contrast, upper and lower piles of apple are different in meaning. These vectors of Bert are the output vectors. Each vector represents the meaning of that word. So we might be able to say, wow, Bert has learned the meaning of each Chinese character. In the process of filling in the blanks, maybe it really understands Chinese. For it, Chinese characters are no longer unrelated. Since it understands Chinese, it can do better in the next tasks. Then the question you might ask next is, why does Bert have such a magical ability? Why? Why can it output vectors that represents the meaning of the input words? Here, John Rupert Firth, a linguist in the 1960s, proposed a hypothesis. He said, to know the meaning of a word, we need to look at its company. Which are the vocabularies that often appear with it? That is, its context. The meaning of a word depends on its context. So take the character guo in pingguo for example. If it often appears with eat, tree, etc., then it may refer to the edible apple. If it often accompanies electronics, patents, stock price, etc., it may refer to Apple the company. So, the meaning of a word can be inferred from its context. And what Bert does in the process of learning to fill in the blanks, maybe it's learning to extract information from the context. When we were training Bert, we give it W1, W2, W3, and W4. We cover W2 and tell it to predict W2. How does it predict W2? It looks at the context. It extracts information from the context to predict W2. So this vector is the essence of its contextual information, which can be used to predict what W2 is. Thoughts like this already existed before Bert. In the past, there was a technique called word embedding. There is a technique in word embedding called SIBO. What SIBO does is exactly the same as Bert. Make a blank space and ask it to predict what is in the blank space. This SIBO, this word embedding technique, can give each vocabulary a vector, which represents the meaning of that vocabulary. Then someone will ask, why? SIBO is a very simple model. It uses two transforms. It is a very simple model. Someone will ask, why does it only use two transforms? Can it be more complicated? The author of SIBO, Thomas Mikolov, once came to Taiwan. At that time, when I was in class, people often ask me, why is SIBO only in linear and why not use deep learning? I asked Thomas Mikolov this question. He said that it could use deep learning. But the reason for choosing a linear model, a simple model, the biggest concern, was actually the performance. Computing power at that time was not in the same order of magnitude as today. It was probably, in 2016, the technology was not in the same order of magnitude a few years ago. At that time, it was still difficult to train a very large model. So he chose a relatively simple model. Today, when you use Bert, it is equivalent to a deep version of SIBO. You can do more complicated things. And Bert can also produce different embeddings from the same vocabulary, according to different contexts. Because it is an advanced version of word embedding that considers context, Bert is also called contextualized embedding. These vectors or embeddings extracted by Bert are called contextualized word embedding. I hope everyone can accept this answer. Any questions you would like to ask? Do you think it's acceptable? Any questions? Okay, if you can accept this answer, that's great. You can sleep soundly tonight. But I want to talk a little bit more. Something that will keep you awake tonight. This answer, however, is it really true? This is the answer you will hear the most in literature. When you discuss Bert with others, this is the reason most people will tell you. Is it really true? Here is one incomprehensible experiment done by a student in our lab. The experiment goes like this. We apply Bert trained for text to classify proteins, DNA strands, and music. Let's take the classification of DNA strands as an example. DNA, as you know, is a series of adenosine. Not adenosine triphosphate. What's it called? It's called nucleobase, right? DNA is a series of nucleobases. There are 4 kinds of nucleobases, represented by A, T, C, and G respectively. So a DNA strand looks like this. Okay, our problem is to do DNA classification. Given a DNA strand, try to determine which category the DNA belongs to. So here the letters represent DNA. These things here are categories. You might ask, what does EI, IE, and N stand for? Do not mind the details. I don't know either. Anyway, it's a matter of classification. Just train it with the training data and label data, and it's done. Here is the magical part. DNA can be represented by ATCG. Now, we are going to use BERT on DNA classification. How? We assign each letter to a corresponding English vocabulary. For example, A as we, T as you, C as he, and G as she. The corresponding words are not important. You can generate them randomly. A can correspond to any vocabulary. So are T, C, and G. It doesn't matter. It has little effect on the result. You turn a string of DNA into a string of words. It's just that this string of text is incomprehensible. For example, AGAC becomes we, she, we, he. Don't know what it's talking about. And then threw it into a general BERT with CLS token, an output vector, a linear transform, and classify it. It's just that the classification is to DNA classes, which I don't know what they mean. And as before, linear transform uses random initialization, and BERT is initialized by pre-trained model. But the model used for initialization is the one that learns to fill in the blanks. It has learned how to fill in the blanks in English. You might think that this experiment is completely nonsense. What is the purpose of BERT? If we pre-process a DNA sequence into a meaningless sequence? Everyone knows that BERT can analyze the semantics of a valid sentence. How can you give it an incomprehensible sentence? What's the point of doing this experiment? The magical thing is that here are different tasks. There are 3 classifications of that protein. Then protein is made up of amino acids. There are 10 kinds of amino acids. Just give every amino acid a random vocabulary. Then DNA is a set of ATCG and music is also a set of musical notes. Give it a vocabulary for each note. Then do it as an article classification problem. Train it hardly. You will discover that if you didn't use BERT, the result you get is the blue part. If you use BERT, the result you get is the red part. It's actually better. Most of you must be very confused now. You guys are probably recalling the song where kids had a lots of question marks on them. This experiment can be described by no other words but magical. No one knows why it works. And currently, there's no good explanations yet. The reason I wanted to talk about this experiment is to inform you that there are still a lot of work to do to understand the power of BERT. I am not trying to deny the fact that BERT is able to analyze sentences' meanings. From the embedding, we clearly observe that BERT knows the meaning of every word. It spots out the words that have similar meanings and those that do not. But as I was trying to point out, even if you give it a meaningless sentence, it can still classify the sentences very well. So perhaps its power does not entirely come from understanding the actual article. There might be other reasons. For example, maybe BERT is simply a better set of initial parameters. Perhaps it is not necessarily related to the semantics. Maybe this set of initial parameters is simply better at training large models. Is it so? This question requires further research to answer. The reason why I want to talk about this experiment is to let you know that the models we are using currently are often very new, and further research is needed for us to understand its capabilities. Before I finish the class, there is still something I want to talk about. What you learned today about BERT is only a drop in the ocean. I will put the links to some videos here. If you want to learn more about BERT, you can refer to the links. You don't need to watch it if you aren't interested. You won't need it for the homework, nor the remaining of the semester. I just want to tell you that there are many other variants of BERT. Next, I'm going to talk about a BERT called Multilingual Bert. What is the magic of Multilingual Bert? It is trained by a lot of languages, such as Chinese, English, German, French, and etc. Train the BERT with fill-in-the-blank questions. This is how the multilingual's BERT is trained. The Multilingual Bert has a very magical feature. The Multilingual Bert released by Google is trained with 104 different languages. So it is able to do fill-in-the-blank questions in those 104 languages. Here comes the magical part. If you training it with English Q&A data, it will automatically learn how to do Chinese Q&A. I don't know if you fully understand what I mean. So here is an example of a real experiment. Here are some of the training data. They used Squad for fine-tuning. It's an English Q&A dataset. The Chinese dataset was released by Delta, called DRCD. This dataset is also the dataset that we are going to use in the homework. Before BERT was proposed, the results were not good. Before BERT, the strongest model is QANet. Its correct rate is only, well, I mean F1 score, not accuracy, but you can temporarily think of it as accuracy or the correct rate. Its correct rate is 78%. What about BERT? If we allow pre-training with fill-in-the-blank questions in Chinese, then fine-tuning with Chinese Q&A data, then it achieves 89% correct rate on Chinese Q&A test sets. In fact, human beings can only do 93% on the same dataset, so the performance is quite impressive. The magical thing is, if we take a multilingual BERT and fine-tune it with English Q&A data, it can still answer Chinese Q&A questions and has 78% correct rate. This is almost the same as the accuracy of QANet. It has never been trained to translate between Chinese and English, and has never read the Chinese Q&A data collection. It takes this Chinese Q&A test without any preparation, and somehow it managed to answer them, even though it had never seen Chinese tests. Sounds amazing, right? Some of you might say. It had read 104 languages during pre-training. One of the 104 languages was Chinese. Was Chinese, right? If yes, this is not surprising. But during pre-training, the learning goal is to fill in the blanks. It can only fill in the blanks in Chinese. With this knowledge, and the ability to do English Q&A, somehow it learned to do Chinese Q&A automatically. Sounds magical, huh? So how did BERT manage to do it? A simple explanation is, maybe different languages don't have that much differences. For the multilingual BERT, whether you show it in Chinese or English, for the words sharing the same meaning, their embeddings are close. So maybe rabbit in Chinese is close to rabbit in English. In the embedding, jump in Chinese is close to jump in English. Fish in Chinese is close to fish in English. Swim in Chinese is close to swim in English. Maybe it had learned this automatically during the learning process. This is not simply a hypothesis. It can be verified. We actually did some verification. The criterion for verification is called mean reciprocal ranking. The abbreviation is MRR. We won't go into details here. You just need to know that the higher the value of MRR, the better the aligning between different embeddings. A better aligning means that words with the same meaning but from different languages will be transformed to closer vectors. If the MRR is high, then the vectors of words with the same meaning but from different languages are closer. The vertical axis is MRR. The higher, the better. Okay, what is this? Rightmost dark blue line? This dark blue line is the MRR of multilingual BERT. With 104 languages released by Google, its value is very high. This indicates that there's no much difference between different languages. Multilingual BERT just looks at the meaning, and different languages do not have much difference to it. We tried to train the multilingual BERT by ourselves. We used fewer data. Only 200,000 sentences were used in each language. The data was fewer. The result of our self-training model was not good. We did not know why. Our multilingual BERT couldn't align different languages together. It seemed that it couldn't learn those symbols that had the same meaning in different languages. They should have the same meaning. This matter had bothered us for a long time. Why did we this experiment? Why? Why did we train multilingual BERT by ourselves? Because we wanted to understand what makes multilingual BERT. We wanted to set different parameters, different vectors, and see which vector would affect multilingual BERT. Which vector would affect the capability of multilingual. But we found that, for our multilingual BERT, no matter how you adjusted the parameters, it just couldn't achieve the effect of multilingual. It just couldn't achieve the effect of alignment. One day we suddenly felt that maybe the amount of data was not enough. 200,000 per language was not enough. We increased the data 5 times larger to see if we could achieve alignment. Before doing this experiment, everyone was a little bit resistant. Everyone felt a little scared because the training time had to be 5 times longer than the original one. What happened in the end? This was the graph of loss. After training for 2 days, nothing happened. The loss couldn't even decrease. Just when we were about to give up, the loss suddenly fell. It took 8v100 to train. We also didn't have 8v100 in our lab. It was run from a machine at NCHC, National Center for High Performance Computing. After training for 2 days, the loss didn't fall. It seemed to fail. When we were about to give up, the loss dropped. Okay, this is a Facebook post from a certain student. I quote it here to tell you the exclamation in my heart at that time. The whole experiment has to run for more than a week to learn it well for the 1 million data per language. Is it useful to have more data? Wow, yes, it is. With more data, it can learn the alignment. So it seems that the amount of data is a very critical factor to the SUSES to align different languages together. So sometimes the magical thing is that many problems or many phenomena show up only if there's a sufficient amount of data. In the past, no one has said, what kind of model has the capability of multilingual? It can be trained on QA in a language and then directly transferred to B language. No one has ever said anything about this. It came out in the past few years. One possible reason is that there was not enough data in the past. There is enough data now. There are a lot of computing resources now. So this phenomenon is now possible to be observed. Okay, there is the last one here. I know the time is almost up, but I want to talk about the last magical experiment. Don't you think this whole thing is still a bit weird? I think the whole thing is weird. What's weird? You said Bert could put symbols with the same meaning in different languages together and make their vectors close. But when training multilingual Bert, if giving it English, it can fill in the blanks in English. If giving it Chinese, it can fill in the blanks in Chinese. It won't mix together. Then, if there is no difference between different languages, how is it possible to fill in the English sentences with only English tokens? Give it an English sentence. Why will it not fill the blank with Chinese tokens? It just doesn't do it. It means that it knows the information of the language is also different. Those symbols from different languages are still different after all. It does not completely erase the language information. So I came up with a research topic. Let's find where the language information is. Later we find out that the language information doesn't hide itself very deep. A student finds out that we put the embedding of all the English words into multilingual Bert, taking the average of the embedding, and we do the same thing with Chinese words. Their difference is the gap between Chinese and English. What are magical things? Here, we give multilingual Bert a sentence in English and get its embeddings. We add this blue vector to the embeddings, which is the gap between English and Chinese. These vectors become Chinese from the perspective of multilingual Bert. Then when you ask it to fill in the blanks, it can actually fill in the answer in Chinese. So it's amazing. With this magical thing, you can do a wonderful unsupervised translation. For example, you show Bert this Chinese sentence. This Chinese sentence is Nang bang ju wo de xiao nu hai zai xiao zhen de ling yi bian. Mei ren nang bang ju wo. Now we throw this sentence into multilingual Bert. Then we take out one of the multilingual Bert layers. It does not need to be the last layer. It can be any layer. We take out a certain layer and give it an embedding, plus this blue vector. For it, this sentence immediately transforms from Chinese to English. Its output is doing reconstruction. When doing this fill-in-the-blank question, its answer suddenly becomes English. And, of course, it cannot do a complete translation. It looks a bit weird. For example, Mei ren nang bang ju wo. It becomes there shi wu ren ren can help wo. Then it knows that bangju is help. It knows that there needs to be added here and so on. Ah, I just made a mistake. The sentence entered just now is actually in English. I just thought the input was Chinese. I was wrong. Sorry. I'll repeat it again. The sentence entered is in English. The sentence is, the girl that can help me is all the way across town. There is no one who can help me. The sentence Bert sees is in English. After inputting English to Bert, the hidden layer in the middle, converted and plus a blue vector. In a flash, the Chinese come out. There is no one who can help me. Becomes, there she wu ren can help wo. Me, becomes, wo. No one, becomes, wu ren. So it somehow can do the unsupervised token level translation. Although it's not perfect. The magical thing is that Multilingual Bert still keeps semantic information.